Hello everyone, I am just continuing on with some chapter readings of I Was a Doctor in Auschwitz. Auschwitz, a day within its borders. Auschwitz, which housed the largest Nazi extermination camp, lies in Upper Silesia, about 25 miles from Katowice. As if nature had created it for just this purpose, even the soil itself is dead. No tree, no flower relieves its gray monotony. To our life there, which was already beyond endurance, the mud and heavy clay which stuck to our wooden shoes added an almost insurmountable difficulty. There was no water except for the rain which swept cold and hard over the flatness of the entire reservation, seeping into the barracks and forming icy rivulets on the thin wooden walls of our last refuge. The only animals we ever saw were crows, rats, and lice, which shared our miserable life by stealing the crumbs out of our mouths, building their nests in our cages, and crawling over our sleeping bodies at night. The approximately 40 square miles of Auschwitz were divided into smaller camps, marked by different letters of the alphabet. These camps were separated from one another by barbed wire fences with high-voltage electric current running through them. A similar electric wire fence surrounded the entire reservation. It often happened that women who could no longer stand the inhuman tortures threw themselves on these wires, hoping to end their lives quickly and, so to say, easily. But fate was not so merciful. The current was not strong enough to kill, and they remained hanging on the fence, sometimes for days, suffering unimaginable torture until they either died from exposure or were shot to death by a guard. Each camp consisted of endless rows of blocks, dirty rat-infested wooden barracks, housing about 1,200 persons each. Along the inner walls of the barracks there were 3 rows of wooden shelves, one above the other, and these shelves were our bedrooms, living rooms, dining rooms, and studies, all in one. They were divided by vertical planks as regular intervals. Each of these cage-like contraptions served as sleeping room for 30 to 36 persons. Once in a while the shelves would collapse under the weight of the sleepers, and the inmates fell on one another in a bloody medley resulting in broken bones, bleeding wounds, loud wailings, and more often than not a whipping by the block superintendent. A few washrooms were scattered over the camp, with one single faucet in each and a big sign above it. Attention, polluted water, not for drinking. But what did we care? We drank it all the same. We had to drink to cool our burning tongues and stomachs, which were constantly on fire from the saltpeter mixed in our food. There was one latrine for 30 to 32,000 women, and we were permitted to use it only at certain hours of the day. We stood in line to get into this tiny building, knee-deep in human excrement. As we all suffered from dysentery, we could rarely wait until our turn came and soiled our ragged clothes, which never came off our bodies, thus adding to the horror of our existence by the terrible smell which surrounded us like a cloud. The latrine consisted of a deep ditch with planks thrown across it at certain intervals. We squatted on these planks like birds perched on a telegraph wire, so close together that we could not help soiling one another. No one who had to live without the small comforts of even the poorest kind of life can imagine what it is to have to do, for instance, without paper. There was, of course, no toilet paper in the latrine, and we had no way of obtaining paper except when somebody stole some from the storerooms around the crematories. We got into the habit of tearing tiny squares of material off our shirts, drying our eyes with them first, then using them to clean our rectum. However careful we were, the shirts got shorter and shorter until there was nothing left but the shoulder straps and a narrow strip around our chest. And then somebody denounced our practices, and the SS decided to hold a shirt inspection. One morning, at Gisella Perl, roll call, we had to lift our skirts and hold them up while laughing SS men walked through our lines, whipping our naked bodies and selecting many of us to die in the flames as a punishment for having damaged camp property. Life in Auschwitz began at 4 o'clock in the morning, when we had to crawl forth from our holes to stand for roll call in the narrow streets separating one block from another. We stood in rows of 5 at arm's length from one another, soundless and motionless for 4, 5, or 6 hours at a time in any kind of weather all year round. When we were ready to faint with exhaustion, our torturers arrived, fresh, gay, and ready for new feasts of torture. The number had to be complete. Even the dying and dead had to be brought out to stand at attention. If anyone did not appear, she was tracked down and thrown into the flames alive. The same punishment was meted out to those who collapsed, fainted, or cried out with pain when hit by a whip. Often, for God knows what reason, the SS decided to punish us all, and after roll call, all 150,000 of us had to kneel down in the snow or mud to stay there on our bruised, bleeding knees for another hour or two. How often did I see women fall out of the ranks in a dead faint without being able to succor them, to bring them even the most primitive of comforts, a glass of water. There was another kind of roll call too, a practice which they called selection. The selection was a special kind of torture invented for our benefit, during which we died and resurrected 1,000 times, thrown back and forth between despair and hope, our eyes, our whole being concentrated on Dr. Mengele's hands. Those hands had the power either to condemn us to immediate execution or to prolong our miserable life by a few days. With an easy nonchalance, the young, handsome, elegant camp doctor pointed to those who looked ill or weak, whose faces he did not like, or who simply fell into the radius of his gesture. 200 to 300 people at a time were then pulled out of the lines, some screaming and fighting, some resigned and dignified, some too stunned to understand what was going on, to be thrown on the ever-present black Red Cross trucks and carted off to the crematories to be given the only kind of freedom that existed for us: death. After the morning roll call, we were permitted to crawl back into our cages to stretch out for a moment before dinner distribution began. After dinner, we had 2 hours to ourselves. The use of this short time was developed into an art. It filled our thoughts day and night, and we planned every minute of it as carefully as in the past we used to plan our work, our entertainment, our studies. First we ran to the water faucet to still our burning thirst, fighting, pushing, screaming at one another, trembling that time would be up before we could obtain a few drops of the life-sustaining liquid. Sometimes we could secure enough water to rub down our bodies, but most of the time we had to content ourselves with taking off our rags and shaking the lice out of them. After the battle for water was fought, we hurried to find our friends and relatives, exchange a few words of affection, and comfort one another with the hope that the day of liberation was near, if we could only keep alive until then. Before we had time to recover from the morning roll call, the call for the afternoon roll call rang through the camp. Again we had to line up in rows of 5. Again we had to stand soundless and motionless at arm's length from one another, in rain, snow, wind, hail, or scorching sunshine, wondering whether selection or beating or kneeling on the ground would follow this horrible routine. All the time we kept our faces turned toward the sky, watching the red glow of the crematories taint the clouds, and we swallowed bitter, hopeless tears for the people whose bodies turned into ashes which covered the ground, and into the soot which blackened our upturned faces. After the second roll call came the distribution of supper. This meal consisted of 200 grams of bread baked of the lowest grade of flour mixed with sawdust, and a dab of margarine or a spoonful of smelly marmalade or a slice of putrid sausage. We had to consume our fare sitting in our bunks in complete darkness, as there was no light whatsoever permitted in the barracks. The building was filled with noise, complaints, screams, and desperate sobs. Some cried with physical pain, others mourned their recently murdered relatives or friends, and others again cried because their piece of bread had been stolen in the scramble for food. There was an unbearable tension in the air which turned the prisoners against one another and bred hostility instead of solidarity. To reach the upper bunks, we had to climb over the edge of the 2 lower shelves, and it often happened that in the darkness we stepped on one another's hands, feet, or even heads. These accidents brought forth torrents of curses and cruel words, and the noise would serve as a provocation for another severe beating before the day was over. The Nazi method of completely dehumanizing us before throwing us into the fire worked beautifully. Only a very few, the strongest, the cleanest, the noblest, were able to retain a semblance of human dignity. The rest were engulfed by the gurgling swamp of crime, mental deterioration, and filth. Soon after supper we were silenced by the brutal voices of the guards outside. Lager Ruhe! Silence! Huddled together, Body against body, in a medley of arms, legs, and heads, we fell asleep on the hard planks, without pillow, without blankets, to dream of days long past, of food, water, comfort, and the proximity of our loved ones. Dinner at Auschwitz. We had always known that hunger existed. We had read Knut Hamsun's book, Hunger, and suffered together with his hero, and we had read Fink's I Am Hungry. But the great writer who could describe the hunger we had to endure at Auschwitz has yet to be born. No one who has not experienced the unbearable pain of hunger during the intervals between Auschwitz dinners has any idea as to what hunger really means. At night, lying on the cold boards of our cage, we tried to pacify our throbbing entrails with the promise of food. Tomorrow we'll get dinner, we said to ourselves. Tomorrow they'll distribute some warm food. In the morning, when we had to stand roll call under the clouds, tinged red by the flames of the crematory, we were trembling with expectancy, hardly able to stand the slow passing of time until dinner. Standing or kneeling in scorching heat or driving rain or snow, we had only one thought, one desire carried by our bloodstream into every part of our body: food. We were hungry. We wanted food. Warm food. We waited for the food with the same burning impatience, the same excited imagination with which a young girl waits for her lover. Dinner was the most important moment of the day, the only moment worth living for. The kitchen was far away from the barracks at the end of the camp, and that was where they prepared our luxurious dinner, the turnip soup. When the soup was done, the prisoners working in the kitchen put out the tremendous pots on the street, 30 to 50 pots in a line. Then, under constant supervision by the SS women, these pots were carried to the barracks to be distributed among the inmates. The block superintendent, the Blokova, chose 10 to 12 prisoners to be sent for the soup. "Dinner distribution," she yelled, and the poor, starved skeletons took their places in their cages to wait for the life-giving liquid. Our tortured stomachs hurt more and more at the thought of food. Our salivary glands worked overtime, and we could already feel the smell of food in our noses long before it arrived. Finally, it arrived. It was there. The superintendent stood in the middle of the floor beside the steaming pot and distributed the horrible concoction into 3-quart containers, which were to serve 6 prisoners each. The containers were dirty and smelly, having been used the night before for entirely different purposes, but their smell blended beautifully with the indescribable smell of the turnip soup. We didn't care. It was warm and it was food, even if there were pieces of wood, potato peeling, and unrecognizable substances swimming in it. The container went from hand to hand, and we swallowed quickly, convulsively, so as to get some of it down before the next in line grabbed it from our hands. We counted each other's swallows jealously, enviously, careful that none of us should get more than her share. Sometimes we agreed that everyone should get 10 mouthfuls and waited patiently for our turn. 10 miserable mouthfuls, and it was over. We were hungrier than before. If only once we could have kept the whole container to ourselves. If only once we could have eaten the whole 3 quarts of soup alone. How much strength, how much new hope we would have gained from having our hunger stilled at least once. Sometimes the can fell out of a weakened hand, and the soup spilled over, leaving nothing for the 6th person, whose mute tears were the most terrible punishment for the offender, whose carelessness had deprived her of the miserable nourishment. Dinner was over, and the barracks were loud with the screams, the plaints of the prisoners who were begging for a little more, just a little more soup. But the pots were empty. 2 prisoners picked them up and carried them back to the kitchen to be filled again, tomorrow with the same miserable amount of thin, unnourishing liquid, which would again leave us hungrier, more unhappy than before. Quickly, the strongest, most energetic among us jump down from their cages and run to the door, where they catch up with the prisoners carrying the empty pot. Screaming, pushing each other aside, fighting, they stick their arms into the pot to get another mouthful of turnips or potato peeling, which stuck to the side of the pot. Sometimes they come face to face with the last transport of soup intended for the last of the barracks. Like wild animals, they attack the carriers, unmindful of the blows and kicks showering down on them, and using their palms as spoons to try to get a little more food into their unsatisfied stomachs. There must have been something in that turnip soup, I don't know what, that made us hungrier than we were before. I always was busiest after dinner. There were bleeding heads to bandage, broken ribs to be taped, scratches to be cleaned, burn wounds to be soothed. I worked and worked, knowing only too well that it was hopeless, because tomorrow everything would begin again. Even the patients would probably be the same. Dinner distribution was over, and before we had swallowed the last mouthful, we already began to wait for tomorrow, hoping that then, maybe, we would at last be able to satisfy our gnawing, desperate hunger. And not far from us, at the other end of the camp, at the SS kitchen, cooks, dressed in white, were preparing the most elaborate dishes, white bread, sweets, and real coffee with cream, for our jailers.